Hey everyone, James from TDB here, bringing you another Inbetweenisode. Today I am going to be talking a little bit about kind of the tug of war between learning and enjoying in tea. Obviously these two things are not totally mutually exclusive, but I'm going to get into a little bit more about why I described it as a little bit of a tug of war. Obviously learning can be completely enjoyable. In fact, I find learning to be very, very enjoyable, learning about tea, but also other things. But I do think eventually you're going to settle into more of a routine, and where finding enjoyment isn't necessarily pushing the limits on learning or trying a bunch of samples every week, something like that. So going to be getting a little bit more into that later on in the video. So for me personally, I really like pouring myself into things. Tea has been one of those things. Certainly when I was learning about it at first, over a decade ago at this point, probably more like 12 years, 13 years, something like that. I really dove in, did a lot of research, ordered a lot of samples, did a lot of vendors. Good example of one way that I really tried to learn about tea is to kind of like specialize yourself, at least for kind of a certain period of time in a tea. What does that really mean? That means kind of just focus a lot on that tea. Ideally have a lot of different samples from different vendors, that sort of thing. And it's an approach I highly recommend if it sounds interesting to you. A good example of this is the Tea of the Month reports I did on tdb.org back in 2012, 2013, 2014, I forget what years. And those were a lot of fun to do at the time. And basically what I would do is I would pick kind of a topic. So one topic, a broader topic, could be like Wui oolongs, try a bunch of Wui oolongs from a handful of different vendors. Another one I did was Iwus. Those poor months were particularly big, where I was trying a ton of different samples, and I'd make sure to cycle back on samples, especially if they were really interesting or whatnot. So really, it's like this concentrated learning where you're brewing the same sorts of teas over and over, sometimes the same tea, trying it in different ways, and you're really kind of experimenting and just trying to learn the different dynamics of the tea. And I think it's a really strong way to learn about tea. That way you can avoid things like, oh, I tried right pour once and it was a little fishy, but I don't know about the context. I don't know, maybe that particular right pour wasn't good, and I'm actually a fan of most of kind of the decent examples of that category. Or maybe I'm not a fan of like this really specific type of Iwu tea from this one vendor, but I like Iwu tea generally. So I do recommend people sample really broadly and things like that, especially when trying to learn. And I think this is a very good way to learn. Just getting a lot of different repetitions in a relatively concentrated amount of time. We learn a lot by contrasting teas versus each other. So we talked about like kind of having a tea stuck in the mind, even if it's not like actually in your taste buds. And that can definitely happen where teas, you're comparing today's tea versus yesterday. Obviously, that's not something that isn't necessarily always going to be enjoyable, but it is, in my opinion, a really great way to learn. So let's see. So I suspect a lot of people that follow this channel have a similar point of view. I don't think it's everyone, and I think that's totally fine. You can absolutely learn about tea by drinking different types of tea and just whatever hits your boat on that specific day, bouncing from a Wui oolong. Paying attention is a lot of that too. But for me, at least, this is what I found is kind of like the most efficient and a way that appeals to me the most. And unsurprisingly, it's also a way that I poured myself into a bunch of other things, some different films, film genres, things like that. Cooking is another good example of this too. I really enjoy cooking and stuff like that, but when I'm like trying to tackle or learn a bit about like, I don't know, Persian food or something like that, I'll try a bunch of different dishes. I'm not going to try just, try Persian chicken once and then go. I'd rather try that same recipe a couple different times, try a couple different ones from different sources, things like that, and just see kind of, it allows you to kind of learn the different interactions and kind of see the common themes. Because, you know, if you're learning from one person, you're going to be subject to all the little tiny peculiarities that might actually be specific to that person and not necessarily that cuisine or that tea or whatnot. So wanted to mention that as kind of another example of something. Obviously, I'm not going to cook. There's a limit to this. You're not going to drink 10 teas in a day all on your own unless you're a complete psycho. But drinking 2 or 3 teas in a day, Iwu teas, and then doing it again the next day, it might result in a lot of caffeination. But if you're paying attention to those teas, you're also going to do a lot of great learning too. So is that type of learning enjoyable? In my opinion, absolutely yes, for myself. But to a certain point. That's the sort of learning where I really enjoy doing it, especially when it's appealing. It's like something I actually want to learn. But eventually what happened with those tea of the month reports, and why I don't keep on doing them, is they started to feel more like a chore. So you're spending time, you're spending money on the samples, and it's no longer as enjoyable as just kind of drinking what fancies your boat at that certain time. So at a certain point, I think this is going to be most drinkers. In fact, there's probably some people that can kind of just infinitely go in kind of like that different sampling phase. For me, at least, that's really not particularly appealing at this moment. Once you have enough like C or C minus sessions of random samples, you start to be like, okay, the purpose is actually for me to enjoy this tea. I'd rather drink something that I actually have in the stash that I know is good, that I know I'm going to enjoy. So you get into a little bit more of a relaxed enjoyment is the way I'm kind of describing it. You certainly can learn in this phase as well. In fact, I think I, as well as most people that follow this channel, are constantly learning about tea. Nevertheless, you're not probably learning quite as quickly as you were in kind of like more of that initial phase. And, it's diminishing returns. You wouldn't expect to learn quite as quickly as you were then. And I think this is where we really start to value different variety. You're going to, of course, learn more about tea, and you're going to know more about Wu Yulong if you only drink Wu Yulong. But that's not enjoyable. So some variety is, usually what people actually want to drink, bouncing between different teas. Of course, there's some teas that are going to get phased out, not necessarily because of the quality, but just because maybe it's something you don't particularly enjoy at the time. For me, at least, this has really been raw pur, something that you can look at Marshall and Speed Test. That's another good one to kind of think about, kind of this more enjoyment, consistency phase. That's the type of tea that, while it's higher quality than something like ripe pur, most days I drink ripe pur, but I almost never drink young raw pur unless it's for the show or if I'm drinking tea with a friend. And that's just simply because it doesn't kind of fit into the rhythms and the nuances of my life right now. So it's important that these teas that you're kind of going to enjoy on this more routine basis, that's almost like a ritual, it fits into the context of one's life too. So for me, at least, pounding samples is not necessarily enjoyable all the time. I do enjoy occasionally sampling a bunch of different teas and things like that, but it's not something I'm doing for the majority of the year, maybe only, a month or so, a month or two worth of sessions. Because I'm not drinking 3 teas a day. I don't want to drink 3 teas a day. It doesn't sound appealing to me now. It might have 10 years ago, but it no longer does. So I'd rather drink 1 tea and really enjoy that tea. Am I paying quite as much attention as I did 10 years ago? Maybe, maybe not. It kind of depends on the tea. Like the ripe I have in the morning, I'm not necessarily taking super detailed notes on every ripe. But, if I'm going to drink something nice and special just because, then, it helps to pay attention. So I think it does depend a lot contextually, too. So it's something really interesting. It's like something like a ripe is not something I found particularly compelling on those Tea of the Month reports. Certainly not compared to young raw pur, where I did a bunch of different reports on them. But ripe, I'm drinking every day. And those raw purs, while they might technically be higher quality, I'm just not. One last dynamic I wanted to mention too is some people actually discover that the entire enjoyment of tea it was the kind of learning part of it. And that's really interesting to observe. I've seen that probably only just a few times. And those people tend to just completely disappear from the tea world, which is interesting because they just can never get into that routine that they find enjoyable, and they just realize they actually don't really care for tea. They only like the learning part of it. Another thing that also comes to mind too is very few tea drinkers are just going to drink one type of tea. I know of I'm looking at you, man from Montreal, one person that drinks just like 2 or 3 different teas over and over and over again. But I think most people that follow this channel prefer a little bit of variety. Nothing wrong with that, but optimizing for just sheer quality. So we're just going to try to objectively measure quality and measure it against the price. I think that's not necessarily a recipe for enjoyment for most people. I think most people are going to like a lot more variety, whether that's rotating between 10 teas, 20 teas, something like that. Anyways, this is all just some food for thought on the process of learning versus just kind of that more routine enjoyment. Let me know if you can relate to this video. Let me know if you agree or disagree or if you liked it. Thank you all for tuning in. I will see you all next time. Cheers.